Hey, this is Dizzy Reed from Guns N' Roses, and you're watching GNR Central. Yeah!
Hey everybody, what's going on, and welcome to GNR Central. And I wanted to talk about how there's a lot of people in the GNR camp, both current members and former members, who believe that Interscope Records, who bought Geffen Records back in the day, basically intended to sabotage Chinese democracy and Axl Rose so that he would pretty much be forced to reunite with his old band. So there was a great article written by Art Tavanna recently for Billboard magazine where he talked about the history of Guns N' Roses' album Chinese Democracy. The article was titled The Divisive Legacy and Surprising Future of Guns N' Roses' Chinese Democracy. And in there's a number of references to Jimmy Iovine, who's like a pretty high-powered executive at Interscope. He's basically the head of Interscope. And David Wild, who interviewed Axl back in 1999, he was one of the first journalists to actually hear some of the tracks off Chinese Democracy. He was also the first guy to sit down with Axl Rose as well, and he said around 1999 the album was about 99% musically done, a decade before it was released. He said Axl was trying to respond to the different waves of music, and it seemed like he was trying to wait out the changes to capture something new, says Wild, who opines Interscope head Jimmy Iovine was hoping that Axl would reunite the old band, which fueled the singer's insecurity during the creative process. Wild said past successes weighed on him heavily. There was also an interview with former Guns N' Roses bassist Tommy Stinson, who also played on the record, and he echoed the same sentiments about Jimmy Iovine. He said, I think he, referring to Jimmy Iovine, never gave it a chance. I think he was like, okay, I'll sponsor this, and then the band will get back together and I'll have that. I think he was always waiting for that ball to drop, says Stinson, a theory that was mostly corroborated by Wild. I think to some degree he, referring to Jimmy Iovine, sabotaged the thing. There were a lot of missteps, and they were all the record company related, which had everything to do with the failure of that record, says Stinson. So Tommy Stinson said the same thing in May of 2011. He said Iovine effed up Chinese Democracy. The bassist talked about the many issues Chinese Democracy experienced and blamed Interscope's chairman for the majority of them. So during a recent interview he did around the time with AV Club, he basically ranted about the process of making the record and the negative impact Jimmy Iovine had on it. He said at first we were in there a lot. We were working on the writing aspect of it, but it just kept going on. We had Jimmy Iovine intervening in a not so productive way, and we had other guys coming and going in with nutty ideas. My summation of the whole thing is that Interscope, when they took over Geffen, really led Axl to believe that Jimmy Iovine would be involved and would help get this record done and make it happen. But basically what he did is let it completely fall apart. Then he had this great idea to bring in producer Roy Thomas Baker to make it sound better. So for those of you who don't know, Roy Thomas Baker worked with Queen on a lot of their records. So because Axl was such a huge Queen fan, it seemed like a natural fit. So Stinson went on by saying all he did was re-record everything 3 or 4 different times, trying to make it sound like something it didn't need to sound like, and spend $10 million in the process. My 2 cents on the whole thing is that I really think Jimmy Iovine effed up the whole thing up. He went on to say it was a bummer. Most of the songs that are on the record were now done 10 effing years ago, but all the talking heads in the mix were saying, make him sound better, make him sound better. So we just kept redoing this and that, and it end up coming back down to the same effing songs that were there 10 years ago, except that now they were super dense mishmash of a bunch of instrumentation. He said that whole era pretty much sums up what happened with the record industry, those kinds of people making these kinds of decisions and not really helping the artist. So once Chinese Democracy first came out, Axl had a lot of statements to make about the lack of support they got from the record label, and in an interview he did in 2009, several months after the album was released, he ripped the label pretty badly. So the interview Axl did was with Billboard.com, and they asked Axl's opinion on how Universal handled the promotion of Chinese Democracy. So he responded with a nonsensical 825-word answer that essentially criticized the label without providing any real specifics. In fact, at one point he praised Interscope on multiple occasions and said that Interscope Geffen A&M chairman Jimmy Iovine was sincere in his appreciation of our record. He also declared that he never wanted a huge public rollout and admitted that there were no plans to tour at that point in time. Yet Rose claims he's been asking for a marketing plan for more than 5 years and has received none, and he blames the label for the draft booklet leaking. How that would hurt record sales really was unclear though, and ultimately Axl said the following to conclude the question. He said, so at least in regard to the US, for the most part, I don't look at it like we have a record company. I look at it for the most part like we have a friendly but otherwise cutthroat loan sharks. And we were lucky to get what we got, but feel we could have done more if they were at least, especially with some of their backgrounds, a bit more involved creatively. And then one detail given by Rose concerned his frustration about making a music video. He says that one is coming, which was for the song Better, but of course it never ended up coming out, but it did leak years later. He added he was discouraged from making a video all along by Interscope up until Best Buy requested one after release. Now, perhaps one of the most damning things in the article is from Kevin Kogel, who's also known as Squirrel, and he was the guy who leaked 9 of the 14 tracks of Chinese Democracy before the album came out on his blog Antiquate. So only months before the official release date, he released 9 of the tracks, and he said he left in the oven for so effing long that the end result was every trend over the last 14 years, a little bit of trip-hop, nu metal, 9 Inch Nails. So for Kogel, the anxiety of waiting for Chinese Democracy, or rather waiting for someone else to leak it, was the impetus for the leak. Mysteriously, the CD Chinese Democracy leak, according to Kogel, came directly from the desk of Jimmy Iovine. For Kogel and other infamous leakers, the long incubation period had turned the record into a government secret, and they were GNR's nation-states WikiLeaks. So by 2008, there had already been major waves of leaks, beginning with Eddie Trunk in 2003, which leaked the song IRS, and then there was, of course, the Antiquate leak. So even before the leaks in 2008, most of Chinese Democracy was being pieced together by internet-savvy fans. Everyone in the forums was waiting around for the album to come out, but when it did come out, we'd already heard a lot of it, and there was a bit of exhaustion, said Downsy, who's one of the moderators off the MyGNR forum. And Axl actually posted under the MyGNR forum under the pseudonym Dexter. So in 2014, the guy who was arrested for leaking Chinese Democracy, Squirrel, posted an article about the full story behind our Chinese Democracy leak. And in it, he actually specifically names Jimmy Iovine as being the guy who leaked the actual record to him. So he said, on June 18th, 2008, I sat at my desk in an office building in part of LA called Ladera Heights, which is sort of like a ghetto Culver City. This means nothing to anyone living outside of LA. Whatever, just picture downtown Atlanta with better Mexican food. Around 1 o'clock or so, I get a message from a person in the industry. I'm going to protect this person's identity by referring to them as a male named Steve, with no particular association to speak of. But I will say that if you were to Google this person's real name, you'd have to go through a couple of pages before finding anything related. Steve has a cool job, but as far as the media is concerned, he's just some guy, nobody special. At the same time, even bands Steve worked with were pretty obscure, and none of them were at all related to GNR. I've read exactly what Steve's message said, something to the effect of, "Are you a Guns N' Roses fan?" And of course I said yes. He started sending me a file roughly the size of an album. This was completely unexpected. Why me? I don't know. Maybe Steve had read the editorial I published on June 6th predicting the album would leak. I knew that the album was done and just sitting around. But in that moment, I didn't let my mind go any further than verifying that what I thought I was receiving. I didn't think Steve was bullshitting, but this was a unicorn with a couple of holy grails up its ass. I was skeptical. But he sent me 9 tracks that were without question the bulk of Chinese Democracy. I had heard most of them in one form or the other, but nothing had sounded so close to the finished album. So the story I got from Steve was that a year prior, a friend of his, a courier of some kind, walked into Jimmy Iovine's office and walked out with a CD. 10 tracks, these 9, plus another version of Better that I had never bothered to get from Steve. These mixes were done by Andy Wallace. It was never clear if Steve's friend stole the disc outright or conned an assistant into trusting him with a copy. Steve seemed to think it was the former. I assumed the whole story was bullshit. Who knows, he was saying. He said within 30 minutes or so of confirming the tracks were legit, they were up on antiquiet.com. I didn't put a ton of thought into this act, but I knew this much. As I've said, if I were to simply announce that I had the tracks, no one would believe it. My intent was not to spread it, but to allow people to play through a streamed player to obliterate any doubt. I knew I was starting a fire, and the original editorial does a pretty good job of laying out my mindset during these actions. But I didn't think enough past that. At 2 p.m., I sent 2 brief emails out to Mara Johnston, who was an idolater at the time, and to Wookabus at the PRP.com. I knew that's all I needed to get the shit splattered all over the every music site on the internet. And according to the FBI, I threw a link up on Dig as well. Fair enough. Not too long after that, Guns N' Roses camp finally gets in touch with him, and he gets a visit from the FBI, and he ends up getting charged for leaking the album. And I'm not going to go through the whole story because I did that in another video, but if you guys want to read the entire story of what happened once Chinese Democracy leaks, I've linked to that article down below. It's a really fascinating piece, so you guys can go check that out. Thanks for watching, guys. Hit the like button, be sure to subscribe, and go check us out on gnrcentral.com for the latest and greatest Guns N' Roses news. And you guys can also go check us out on Facebook and Twitter. And you can also go support us on Patreon if you want to see us continue to make videos just like this. And I'd love to know from you guys, do you think the record label sabotaged the release of the album? Put your comments in the section below. Have yourself a good one.